So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Victoria Thacker, and I will be your host for today's session. This webinar is brought to you by the Alberta branch of the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, the only global qualifying organization in Canada where you can become a chartered governance professional. For further information about our programs, webinars, or events, I invite you to visit our website at cgiofcanada.ca. Before we begin the presentation, please note that everyone has been muted. But if you have any questions at all, you can use the QA function, raise your hand, or you can note it in the chat and we can flag them for Miss Halford. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Miss Jane Halford, who will be presenting a CPD session on who does what during a crisis. So, when boards are facing CEO transitions or struggling with their board dynamics, Jane Halford is an advisor they turn to. Jane has served as a board member in the corporate, public, and not for profit sectors, so all around. She is a current board chair for Farm Credit Canada, Herd Whistle Technologies, Rick Hansen Foundation, and the treasurer of the International Women's Forum of Canada. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jane Halford.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. I know you have busy lives, so having you here is amazing. And I wanted to put a shout out to Swati Aurora, who I met about a year ago at a governance presentation, and she was invited me to join you today. So we're going to talk about some drama and intrigue. So hopefully that helps you stay with me. But as Victoria said, please feel free to put your questions in and happy to take them throughout the session. And if I miss some, Victoria is going to be my eyes and ears. So who does what in a crisis? This is always a bit of the tricky part because a crisis can come in any form and any size. And so you can never be ready for every scenario. So I'm going to talk a bit today around how would you start getting ready today? And then when it hits, what are you going to do? So let me start with why this even matters to me. If I go back in time about 15 years, I was sitting actually at a boardroom table in Toronto. And at that time, board books were on paper, not on computer. And I looked down at the board book, and then I got startled by a voice across the table that said, "Are you okay?" And I looked up and I caught the eye of my fellow board members. And just at that moment, he said, "Are you okay?" I followed his stare 2 seats to my left, and our CEO was now slumped over in the chair. The person right beside me to my left was the board chair, and he quickly got up. He started to push the CEO on the wheelie chair into an alcove off of the boardroom. He turned back and looked to the governance professional in the room and said, "Call 911." And like I'm an accountant by background, I had no medical training to be able to offer to this scenario. So myself and the other fellow board members, we just sat in stunned silence. And we were so thankful because the paramedics got there quickly. But for anybody who's been near first responders in that moment of crisis, you realize you don't need to hear what they're saying. You can feel the energy in the room. And so in that moment, we knew it was serious, but they also got the CEO out to the ambulance within that not that much time. So I'll never forget the composure of the board chair as he walked back into the boardroom. And he looked at the board and he said, "Folks, we have about 5 minutes to have this meeting because I've got to deal with the family, I've got to deal with the staff here on site, and now we've got to figure out with our stakeholders." And he looked back to the governance professional and said, "What are the motions we need to pass to appoint an acting CEO?" And so at that moment, you knew whatever he just saw was very serious. And I will never forget that moment because I kept thinking if you're a governance professional, your leadership in this moment of crisis is as important as the board chair at that moment. We passed the motions, and he said, "For those of you from out of town, I suggest you might as well fly home, and I'll keep you posted." And sadly, by the time I landed at home, he had passed away of the stroke he had had in our boardroom. And so I don't share that with you for the drama of it. I'm just sharing it because I was like one person in one meeting at one point in time in history, and suddenly we have a crisis on our hands. And when I think of that moment, other than the personal loss, I actually think of that moment as a point of shame Not shame because I didn't know how to help medically, that wasn't my training, but shame because I failed to recognize that I had skills to offer. I would do it differently today for sure. I also felt like I lacked the confidence to step forward and say, even though I don't know in this moment, how can I help the board members? How can I help the board chair? How can I help the staff? And so just even hearing my story, I hope that you will find that if you face any kind of crisis, whether it's in your board roles, in your governance professional roles, or just in your life, don't underestimate what you have to bring to the table, because it's in those small moments that some idea from some person in the room, real or virtual or on the phone, might be, let's try this one thing. So that's the idea. You're here today. We're going to have more than one thing. So hopefully a crisis never happens to you, and that would be the best thing ever. But if you start to feel the tension growing on something big, feel free to offer to your boards, to your organizations, the things that will actually alleviate that pressure. So, four things for today. We're going to talk about preparing early. We're going to tell you a little bit more about how to stress test the plan that you're going to make, maybe some warnings about what to not do during your crisis, and then also how do you conclude a crisis with confidence. So, before we do that, I'm going to invite you to participate with me. And so, this is the one time the speaker says, please bring out your phones or please log in on your computer. And this is Mentimeter. So, as you're doing that, please know that it's completely anonymous on the back end. So, I'll never know who said what. It's also completely anonymous when I share your results on screen. The idea about this is to be able to engage you from wherever you are, and also for you to be able to share your wisdom, your ideas, and for you to learn from each other, even if you can't see each other. So I think Victoria also has this image and she'll drop it in the chat. So if at any point during the session that you fall outside of Mentimeter, you can go ahead and pick it up. And maybe while you're logging in, one of the reasons that I learned to use Mentimeter is I used to work with a board where 25% of the people on that board either were fully deaf or they were hard of hearing and running through interpreters. And so we can't have the same kind of brainstorming conversation that we might with fully hearing people. And then I realized that this really actually gamifies sessions. And isn't that amazing as an adult learner when you're really challenged to pay attention sometimes? So I'll just give you 10 more seconds and then we'll keep rolling forward on that. And thank you for those of you who are pushing the thumbs up. And maybe one thing to say that you'll know it's working on your device when your device looks exactly like the screen. So if you're kind of thinking, I'm in the wrong place, you're probably in the right place. So in a moment, I'm going to change the slide and your device will also change. So now you'll see the slides in both places. And my commitment to you is that I will send you back all the slides, including all of your own feedback after today's session. So let's move forward. So I'm curious now that you're into Mentimeter, I'm curious to know what's a lesson that you've taken from a crisis that you've experienced in your career. So hopefully it's not as dramatic as mine, but maybe just in a sentence or a phrase, if somebody wants to be able to share, what's something that you took from your experience? I think I shared with you that I took that moment of opportunity to realize that I had something to offer. Since that day, I've experienced a few other crises from the role of board member. And what I realized that was that on those moments, the differentiation between roles is critical. And that's really what informs the rest of this presentation is what are the lessons learned that I had, plus what are the best practices with respect to crisis. So thank you for those of you that I know exist. So the listening and patience, expecting the unexpected, composure, trust yourself. Oh my gosh, these are amazing. I'm so happy that you get to share. Yeah. Yeah, leadership is important, resilience, being calm. I love this. You have lots to say on this. Yeah, having a crisis management plan. We are going to talk about that today. So that's perfect. Oh, let me get a couple. All right, love it. Trust subject matter experts. Yep, that's hard in the moment too because you seem so overwhelmed. Look at this. Thank you for all this feedback. All right. Well, let's carry on. So it truly is never too early to prepare. And I say this because whatever your roles are, daytime, evening, you can do a project. Everybody can do a project. And so if we thought about getting ready for a crisis as a project, you would know what to do. Figure out the roles and responsibilities, create the project plan, figure out the milestones and metrics, adapt the plan if you need to, and then debrief it after completion. So I think when you're working with boards, I always just say to them, if we thought of this as a project, we would be less stressed about even talking about it. And whether this goes for the board members being stressed or the team members being stressed or the CEO saying we don't have time, just whatever you can do to say, hey, let's normalize this, that would be helpful. Because I think if we think of this as there's no crisis going on right now, nobody's getting caught in anything, let's just be thoughtful and get ready. And so we're going to start with taking a look at the roles and responsibilities. And so your organization might use slightly different terminology. You might know how to have a CEO, you have an executive director, you call the person a president or general manager. It doesn't matter. You'll get the sense. But I'm going to walk through each of those because I think in the moment of crisis, knowing what lane you belong in and knowing what lane somebody else belongs in is really critical. So we want to make sure that we're always thinking about what's my role, what's somebody else's role. So the CEO's role in a tiny organization, the CEO will have two roles. I'll talk about the second one in a minute, but in a larger organization, the CEO's job is to keep running the organization. The crisis may be huge, but there's still a whole bunch of things that need to be done, whether that's customer service, whether that's cash flow, like whether that's making sure that suppliers are happy, like, keep running the organization, keep flying the airplane if you're the pilot running into turbulence. So that's really what their role is. They still continue to be the senior decision maker. So the board doesn't accidentally jump in and take away any power and authority. I'm going to talk later about what happens if the crisis involves your CEO, as in they're not available to serve. But generally, if your CEO is there, let them do their jobs. If you're the board member and for the team, let the CEO be supported by the team. I'm going to talk in a minute about what the role of the crisis lead is. And so, in a larger organization, you might have two separate roles. The CEO keeps leading, the crisis lead manages the crisis. But often, the CEO in your organization would be the media spokesperson. So they need to be, ready and trained for the media. But when that media time comes, they may be supported by external advisors or resources, or they may choose, or you may choose together between CEO and chair, who is going to face the media. So we want to make sure we're thinking about all of that. The second role is, of course, the chair's role. The chair's role is to really be that stable, reliable connection to the CEO. Depending on the nature of the crisis, and it looks like a lot of you have had lots of different experiences, this could be hourly connections, it could be daily connections, it could be once a week connections, depending on the pace. But being available, and this is the shocking thing when you're the board chair, suddenly whatever else was going on in your life starts to take a back seat. So you start to scramble a little bit about whatever you're doing in your career or your family or whatever else to be available. The last crisis I dealt with as a chair, I was actually out sailing on the West Coast, and I knew that our cell service was going to come in and out. So I had to really clear with the CEO and the governance professional when I could get to shore so we could take calls. So that was kind of a bit out there because it's pretty hard today's world to actually get away from cell service, but I was in one of those places. The chair's role is to be available for meetings and briefings and to call the special board or committee meetings. So that can take all kinds of different styles. But just like the CEO's job is to keep leading the organization, the chair's role is to keep leading the board. Now, if the chair is the media spokesperson, make sure that that's coordinated. I see that less commonly, but sometimes it can come up, especially if the crisis involves your CEO. So the crisis lead, this is such a luxury if you have this opportunity in your organization. And so a little bit bigger organization where you would have a senior person, probably another executive, who would actually be responsible for the navigation of the crisis plan. So if you have an organization that has a chief risk officer or even a chief financial officer or chief operating officer, sometimes these people are asked to be the crisis lead. And if that's the case, then they really are the point person for the crisis. and the CEO then continues to be the point person for the whole organization. So if you have a crisis lead, their job is to stay connected with the CEO and to make sure that the CEO is always being able to be informed about where we're at, where we're going next, and how things are changing. And then the board, be available and stay connected to the chair. So just because we're in crisis, this does not mean the board needs to jump into management. You don't have to take over their role. You actually have to be able to streamline your work as a board so that you can be nimble, but you're also not in the way. Because, lots of people that are super keen will be like, hey, I have this to offer, or I could do that. And they start messaging and I guess worst case scenario, they start posting on social media. So the chair's job is to keep the board calm, and the board's job is to say, hey, is there a special committee that I need to be at? Is there a special meetings that I need to be at? And if you are one of the people that have a very unique skill, including experience with a crisis of this nature, put your hand up, tell the chair, hey, I've got this, willing to offer it. But it's really the CEO or the crisis lead's decision whether they say yes or no to that. So don't push your way into other people's business, but make it known what you can offer to the scenario. So, how do we get ready for this? Well, whoever is responsible for the media side of a crisis, they need to be ready. So dive on into media training. I know CGIC has a hot seat training, but whatever it is, make sure your CEO has it, your board chair has it, or whoever the backup spokesperson is. Is anybody who's been interviewed by the media, it's stressful enough. So unless you have practice in calm times, it's going to feel terrible in times of stress. I would also suggest that the board and the senior team also know what kind of insurance coverage is there, not just from a recovery point of view, but also a lot of those insurance products today, especially around cybersecurity, business continuity, they often have resources that are there to support the organization as it goes through the crisis. So, for example, a cybersecurity insurance would often have a phone number the organization would call to activate a team that will work with you. So, absolutely critical for many people to know those insurance coverages are out there and who are the contacts. And then the other side is data recovery. And I think that it's not if, it's when will we all have a cyber incident at our organizations. And knowing whether your data can be recovered is key. I've talked to board members over the past year who have had cyber attacks and had ransom requests. And their IT teams and their external service providers said, you know what, we can recover all this data, don't pay. And so they were able to have confidence in their decision not to pay ransom because they knew they could get their data up. So you just need to know which is possible. And so I'm just curious to know from your experiences, what else have you prepared in advance of a crisis? Because this kind of list and your ideas on it will really help each other to say, hey, when I send you back the slides, hey, look what my peers are doing. They're already doing these things. We don't have those things, or that's a good idea. Or even the idea of, I don't even know what that is, and maybe I need to learn from that. So go ahead and share if you have any ideas about things that you've prepared in advance.
So, Jane, while they
Yes.
are doing that, there is a question in the chat
Oh,
or in
thank
the
you.
Q&A.
Okay, well, let me just stop sharing for a minute. Let me go over there. Can the board have a succession plan for governance at the onset, especially in a crisis situation? So I think this is related to what if the board chair wasn't there, or what if a key board member wasn't there? So I love that question because what's critical about it is that for any key role in the organization, you should in fact know exactly who's going to step in case of an emergency. So that's not just the CEO. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but it's also the chair. Is there a vice chair? Do they accept the challenge of stepping in a crisis? And if not, who would do it? So I think there's a different conversation that has to be held at the board to say, in normal circumstances, maybe certain people are, but sometimes they aren't. And I think that to be honest with each other as board members is really critical to be able to showcase that we know that certain people will thrive better. And some of it's quite honestly practical. If you have board members who are taking an extended vacation or having a surgery or something, to actually know they're not available when they're making those bigger life decisions or things happen to them. That's absolutely critical. So let me go back because I might have skipped over a few, but look at all the preparation that you have. I love it. Strike response. That's great. Not every organization is ready for that. Cross training. Yeah. Remote sites. Where do you work from home? Yeah, I think, it's so interesting, in reflection of the experience we all had in 2020. Go home and stay home was a really clear directive for the world. In our reality in 2025, I wish it was that clear, right? This is the moment by moment game plan. All right. Well, thank you for sharing those. Those are absolutely spot on. So let's carry on. So I'm curious to know, even, 15 minutes into our presentation, what do you feel most confident about when you think about your own crisis preparedness? So what's feeling good at this moment? And yes, I'm going to ask the flip side question in a minute about what are you not feeling so good about? Think on one of my boards, we did a tabletop exercise, which may be a term you're not familiar with, which is like a mock scenario. We did that just last month. Um, I felt good about that moment, but I also got more scared because we did that. So the practice was good. That realization that, hey, the more you practice, the more familiar it is. We had a new chief risk officer who would be our crisis lead in that moment, and I thought he did a great job. So it was great to see him in that scenario. So it was a confidence builder. Perfect. Well, thank you for sharing those places that you feel good. Perfect. There's more coming in. Excellent. Well, I'm so happy that a lot of you are already started and that you feel like if this happened today, which we'll talk about in a minute, that it might happen to some of you today, that we actually are ready to go in some ways. And by the end of the session, you'll have a few more tools in your toolkit. So, what are you worried about? If the crisis were to happen tonight, what are you worried about? Because I think this is where we get the greatest, fastest insights on what can we do to get ready. Is like, wow, if I am worried about this, maybe I need to ask myself or ask the team or ask the board some questions so that we can actually help to build those confidence boosting tools along the journey. Pace of recovery. Yeah. I'm an accountant by first profession, and an entrepreneur by second. So the whole idea of restoring data is so amazing to me, and I'm so thankful for smart people. And I saw that in your last responses, a lot of you have lots of confidence in the IT teams around you, whether they're internal or external. But you're right, like that moment's going to come, and are you ready? And is it going to be enough? I've had some interesting conversations with those board members that had cyber attacks, and one of the interesting comments was that one of them said that they did actually pay the ransom, and they were then given reference to, I'm going to call it a help desk. So the cyber criminals have a help desk that you call. And their experience with that help desk was that it was so professional. They said it was the most outstanding customer service they'd ever experienced. And it was on the criminal side. So, anyways, if you end up in that scenario, I think you'll be amazed by how they serve you as their most important client that just gave you them a bunch of money. Okay, let's carry on. So, can you see a crisis coming? I think that a lot of times we see the signs, and whether you're a board member or whether you're somebody within the organization, we sometimes fail to recognize that things are growing, growing, growing. So my encouragement is to have the conversation between the board and the management team is, are there any things that are growing or escalating? So if I put this in today's world terms, if we think about the US presidential election back in November, we heard the platforms of the parties. Was there concern on our minds? Yeah, we're sitting here in Canada. We're not voters, but you could hear the rhetoric. Then when we saw the election results and President Trump was now going to be the president in January, a rising risk because now we knew where he was posturing around different policies his government was going to take. Then we saw the inauguration and we saw the amazing pace of executive orders and a whole bunch of other things. So now with some boards that those realities around what the president was going to do and how it might affect their organization was growing, and it was growing hourly in some of those days. And now, as we saw tariffs come into Canada, it's an active issue. If your organization hasn't been affected with it yet, we're of course all watching to say what's next and what are the side effects on our economy and how will that affect us. And I don't know what's happened in the news today, but today may be one of those days in history where we see a full blown crisis with respect to tariffs. And so some of your organizations may be able to navigate and you might still be back in active issue. Some of you may find that depending on the news of the day, you'll be back in crisis. So it's kind of a dramatic one today and very relevant 2025, but you can start to see this for other things. So I just encourage that constant dialogue between the board and the management team about what's growing in risk and have we elevated to the next level. Because if we're at a growing risk level or an active issue, we need to be double checking that our crisis plans are ready. And so if we need to activate, we're activated. And if we need to make sure all the people are ready to serve, we've had the conversation before any of us get the call. Crisis Resource Kit. Let's call this the toolkit that you will be so thankful you have in the moment of crisis. Policies, procedures, tools, templates. These are the things that are the do it now before a crisis hits. So, for example, lots of boards I work with, the board members don't have contacts. They may not have the phone numbers of their fellow board members. They might not know how to reach executives. They may not know a whole bunch of things. So, just even knowing who are your contacts, who are your external advisors, if you're a team member, where do the key documents live? Can everybody access them? And for some organizations, do you actually require a printed or non-digital copy at somebody's house in case we have an epic issue with respect to digital communication? So that business continuity planning, the insurance, and so I think this will serve you incredibly well as if you actually put together your resource kit. And depending on your role, it depends on where that lives or who has access to it. But this is the piece that whether you're within the management team or if you're on the board side, asking ourselves, where's our kit? Is it complete or what else do we need to build? And take the time in 2025, build one thing at a time. And I shared with Victoria that I'll send you a couple examples of scripts or activity lists that you can use, not because they're perfect, just because they give you some sense and you can try to picture when you see them. If I was actively in a crisis, would I be thankful for this to be there? And one is a script that says, hey, this person needs to call these people and convey these kinds of messages. So it might feel like overkill, but in the moment you'll be incredibly thankful and you can adapt it to your reality. Okay, so now I'm going to assume that you have some kind of plan and it sounds like many of you already have a plan. So let's make sure we're stress testing the plan. So this is the time where we actually step back and say, will our plan hold up in a crisis? And of course, we can never tell exactly what the crisis is going to be. So my first one is like a 15-minute simulation. So one of the things I like to do with boards is work with, let's call it the board chair and maybe the CEO and say, well, let's agree that we're going to set aside 15 minutes in the next board meeting and we're going to do a crisis simulation. We're not going to tell any board members we're going to do this. And then one I would put on the table is my opening story, which is, so now the board chair says, I've just been notified our CEO is never coming back to work. We as the board have to lead this. What are we doing today? And what do we need to do in the next week? And then the CEO, if they're able to participate as an observer, will be probably shocked by the lack of awareness of the board of tools that are already in their toolkit that they didn't know where to find or to see where they struggle. So the debrief of this kind of activity is amazing because I think it both tests the people and what do you know, what do they not know, but also starts to say how would things break down. I've also seen this kind of scenario happen where it's like the board chair isn't coming back and something else is happening. And so, how are we going to navigate it? So, just do a short 15-minute one, and you can do these with all kinds of scenarios, and then your board will get more confident, but also you'll be able to build more tools in your toolkit. But if you're inside of the organization, or if the board wants to ask the CEO to do this, this goes back to the earlier comments that I saw around succession and emergency planning. What would be amazing for the organization and including the key board positions is that we always knew who would take over if somebody was no longer able to work, either temporarily or permanently. So, what I like to encourage executive teams to think about is, could you do an exercise in 1 to 2 hours where you would actually say, okay, we're not going to vaporize you. You're still going to be able to speak for yourself. But what if you had to hand over your job in 10 business days? Well, if that's the case, suddenly you would realize that you can't download your brain, but you could start to brainstorm who would you tell? What would you tell them? What would you document? And then as you debrief this with each other, you start to realize that your peers actually ask an awful lot of questions around, well, what about this? What about this? And you start to see the holes in the plan. The idea here is that if you had the 10-day plan of what you would hand over, you also have a lot going on as far as your emergency plan. So if one of the key people didn't come back or they weren't available, it might be that they're on vacation in Jamaica and they can't serve you from wherever they are. Well, at least we have this document we can pull out and speak to. So I think this is another way to test it and to just give yourself confidence that we would actually be able to navigate because the paperwork would speak to it or the cross training of our peers will speak to it. Okay, so probably what you're interested to know is, what do you not do during a crisis? Because we're just humans, right? So as soon as a crisis happens, our brains go, oh my goodness. So I just encourage you, whatever your role is, to think about, we are in fact humans now working together as a team to navigate this crisis. And so this model here is the Six Human Needs by Tony Robbins. It's just a packaging I like for this purpose, but this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs in a different form. People need certainty. So whatever the crisis is, ask yourselves the question, from my role in this crisis, what can give people certainty? So in some ways, go back to 2020 March, go home and stay home actually created a lot of certainty for people. We didn't know what we were dealing with, how fast it was spreading. It was like, what was COVID going to do for us? But we could tell people to go home and stay home. Now, I don't think that's going to be the reality for your next crisis, but can you say to people, um, we are going to be able to set up a remote office in this location, or we actually don't know what we're dealing with and we will get back to you in 24 hours, or we're going to keep updating you every 24 hours. So even a pace of meetings is certainty. Even conveying back to team members or board members who is playing the different roles is part of certainty. So anything you can offer, not because you are making it up, it's just like, I can only offer you this for this period of time is better than I don't know. So offer certainty where you can. As the crisis starts to get managed, you'll be able to move on to other pieces. Significance is that idea that we see you doing your work, we see you playing your role. We know it's not easy, and so really just acknowledging that somebody is actually working incredibly hard in this moment, not because they have time to take it in, but people still need to feel seen. And then connecting with each other. Yeah, we don't have time for social connected, but even knowing that this is a team meeting, that we get to say appreciation, get to actually just come together and connect, even if that's every hour about the crisis. And then as you get into the crisis closure, it's that growth and reflection to say, what have we learned? How do we go forward? So even though it's a terrible situation, you will wish you're not in it, just remember that you can help lead the humans through this process by thinking about what their needs are. And then maybe a little bit on the fun front, although fun and crisis don't often go together, is that Gary Chapman wrote this book about language of appreciation in the workplace. You might be familiar with his first book, which was The Five Love Languages. And since we can't say love in the workplace, he rewrote this one. The reason I raise it here is in the moment of crisis, everybody's tanks are getting empty pretty fast, right? Their batteries running out of gas because of the stress, the pace, not sleeping, whatever the case may be. So whatever your role is, this is the chance to go back to the connection and significance on the last slide is how do we appreciate people? And people have different languages. So this is a way before the crisis happens to say, hey, who are the key people on the crisis team? And what are their languages of appreciation? Some of them are quality time. So this is a commitment, let's say by a board chair to touch base with the CEO 5 minutes a day if we're in crisis. And if the CEO's language appreciation is quality time, that will fill them up. Words of affirmation, Gary's work says 2/3 of people will actually have this as one of the top two. So this is a quick text, an email, just something, even a verbal, like, thank you for doing that, or I thought that was great, or really appreciate the timeliness of it. And so just feed them the words. Gifts, this is not around monetary gifts, nor do we have time for that. It's the act of gifting. So you can imagine if we're dealing with the crisis in person, it's bringing the box of donuts. It's actually like bringing the coffee, making the coffee, bringing it into the room, like ordering pizza. Like it's that kind of thing. Acts of service, and I think this works really well in a crisis, which is sometimes it's a bit gray whose job it is to do what. So if I'm a board chair and we're in crisis and the CEO, this could either be done by the CEO or the board chair. If I thought that their language of appreciation was acts of service, I'd be like, hey, you know what, as the chair, let me just email the board. Let me take that off your plate. So it's just something small. And physical touch that always, grabs your attention. In Gary's book, he would say there's no place for that. Depends on the crisis, depends on the people. But if you're going through a death or a trauma, there is a space for this in the ways that you feel comfortable, and so does the other people. So it is not off the table in my books, but obviously you need to do that one with care. So appreciate, love on the people, even when you're in the middle of crisis. It will keep their energy up a little bit in the moment of crisis and help you all keep navigating forward. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how big the crisis is, you can't stop. Whatever your role is, you have to keep playing as if it were jazz. The music still needs to be there. If you've made a mistake, keep hitting the same note. It's the same idea of flying the airplane. Like you've hit turbulence, you have to fly the airplane. That's your job. And so keep moving forward, keep recovering, keep jumping back in. And if you can remember that, then we kind of overcome that freeze or the flight scenario that we go into sometimes instinctively as humans. So I have a job to do. I'm going to lean in, I'm going to lean on others, and we're going to keep moving. That's the key. All right. And once the crisis is over, yes, catch your breath, but make sure you don't lose the lessons. So some kind of post-action review, this will take whatever way that you want it to take, but on a non-judgmental way, document what you learned. What did we do well? What would we do differently? What was tricky or awkward or something we could actually just prepare for differently next time? Identify those missing puzzle pieces in the sense of, were we missing training? Were we missing a standard operating procedure? Did we not have the right tools? Did we not have the right advisors? Did it take us too long to activate this thing, and what would do that? So really just saying, like, let's do more training. Let's make sure that if this kinds of scenario would come forward again, we would actually have a better playbook and a better experience. And the other thing that I found with crises when they come up is conflict. And this is not conflict because people are intentionally not working well together. It's because of the pressure of the scenario, in addition to having many people who are all different. And so I find that boards and management teams easily get into this overwhelm zone. So I like this model because it starts to show that yes, we may not have a lot of clarity on some of those tasks. What's the problem? What's the solution? What's the information? What's the process and the timing? That's the nature of a conflict, right? So you're going to have the task problems with your crisis anyways. But what makes it all worse is when the relationships start breaking down. And so hopefully you can catch some of this in the moment, but if you don't catch it in the moment, you may have to go back in the debrief phase to figure out what is it about the relationships that also let us down. So in the crises I've experienced on boards, sometimes it has been a conflict around power and authority. Who had what power? Who had what authority? For example, was there a special committee from the board to oversee the crisis? If so, they had a different level of knowledge than the full board. And was that the right division of authority or power or detail? Don't know. In hindsight, you might have some different thoughts. There's also a whole bunch of issues around trust or assumptions because things are moving quickly. And so if you're not the chair and being briefed every hour, as the case may be, suddenly it's like, well, that person knows more than I do. And so now we start to wonder if we trust the scenario. And of course, in a crisis, it brings out the best of us and it brings out the worst of us. So we can say the wrong things, we can say it the wrong way, we can offend people by accident. Nobody means to do that, but it does happen. And then I think just naturally, a group of humans has a whole bunch of people of different personality and style. So if somebody goes into their boot camp boss kind of command and control, and somebody else needed some more kind of care and empathy, suddenly now we've got a relationship issue. So what I love to use this model with, especially with crisis and by breaking it down, is to actually get people to just talk about what didn't work for us in this past scenario now, so that we can clear it up for the future. So in the one crisis I was involved with, the power and authority was really off between board committees and the board of the whole. We've now gone back and changed policies. We've done some training on that. So the next time it's a different scenario, I hope that's not the problem next time, but we certainly have learned from it. So I love this map. I've actually used it for all kinds of conflicts between boards and management teams. So feel free to take this one. I obviously didn't make it. It was done by Toby Sinclair, but I find it super useful. And of course, go back and update your policies. Make sure the toolkits are ready. If you have risk registers or ways that you monitor risk, if they started to show that escalation that I talked about, then that's great. Then it worked for you. If it missed it, then what did we learn from that? Was it because we didn't have the risk? Or we had the risk, but we weren't monitoring it, or when we were monitoring it, we didn't actually assess it correctly. So there's lots to be learned from that. And then, of course, technology. I think one of the crises I'm aware of where they did a simulation, um, one of the scenarios they said that the organization was based on Microsoft Teams, and they took away the ability to communicate on Teams. Well, if that was your reality, suddenly how do we process stuff? We've got no email, we've got no virtual space. And so that was a real lesson to say, what's our redundancy? Is it text messaging? Is it WhatsApp? Is it Zoom? Don't know, but we should probably have those in mind too. So as you close, one of the closing ideas I have is that yes, bring the lessons learned from the crisis into being a better organization, be a better board member, be a better executive, be a better governance professional, but don't bring the baggage with you, because what will happen the next time a scenario comes up that kind of feels like that past one that was a crisis, people start saying, "Oh, that's that again." Yeah, it's not that again, it's a different scenario. So we don't want to make sure that we don't spin into all the baggage of that past crisis. We want to say, what was the lessons learned? What were the new tools we did? How do we go forward together? So if you start to feel that people are bringing their baggage, it's time to kind of call it out and say, well, remember, we have changed since then. I've been guilty of that. All right, we're going to have some final thoughts and you're going to have time for some questions. So if you want to start dropping them in the chat or in the Q&A, happy to answer them. So let me just go to some questions here and then I'm going to close with some other actions that you can take. So are there any questions anybody wants to share in the chat? If not, I'll keep rolling, but I figured there might be something. All right, well, I will keep rolling. And if you have any, you can still ask them. You have not run out of time. So I think what's most important about a session like this, and whether you're watching it live or whether you're watching it in recording or reviewing it or sharing it with somebody else, like what's one action you're going to take in the next week to better prepare for a crisis? So I think thinking about that, and I'm just going to offer you the space to say, hey, what is one thing I'm going to do differently? I'm going to talk to somebody. I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to check if I have access to documents. That was one thing I did one time is I actually just said, hey, if this was a crisis moment in this organization, if I could go on the board portal and find the crisis plan, that would be great. So I tried that and I could find it, which gave me great confidence. So it's small things like that. It could be even having the conversation at your next committee meeting or your next board meeting that says, how confident are we? Take some of the questions that I asked in this presentation. How confident are you? What's worrying you? Those kinds of things. Excellent. Establishing the crisis plan at the strategic planning session. That's great. What's my role and responsibility? Practice your crisis plan with stakeholders. That's great. And I think that another opportunity, which, there's a crisis, a moment in in the news these days, but taking any of those scenarios that you see in the news and having them as a conversation either in your team at the office or within the board to say, if this were happening to us, what would we do about it? So I'll give you an example. You watch what's going on with Tesla and like all of the damage not only to reputation but also physically to some of their stores and their products. Well, that's got to be being treated as a crisis inside. I have no inside information on that, but the idea is that we can now take that scenario from a straight news perspective and say, hey, if that was our board, what would we be doing to manage this thing? All right. Thank you for the next question. Okay. Do you have any tips on dealing with crisis denial? Oh, yes, I do. Crisis denial. Yes. I think that the best thing you can do with that is to find a way to put on an agenda a crisis simulation and actually say, you know what, here, let's take a news story, whatever the news story is that would be most relevant to your organization. And you say, if this were happening to us and this was at a crisis level, what would we do about this? So consider it a scenario that isn't yours. And then I think maybe through that experience that isn't yours, people start to say, I don't know if we're ready for this. So that's where I often use the death of the CEO as a shocking one for people to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, we've never talked about what happens if our CEO doesn't come back to work. So the same kind of thing, like what happens if your major supplier in your supply chain can't provide you stuff because of whatever reason, tariffs, uh, transportation delay, those kinds of things. What would you do then? So put something realistic on the table, but stress test yourself. So thank you for that question. So anything that can make it real is worth doing. And I think anybody within the organization, whether that's on the board side or the team side, who can get somebody talking about it, that's great. Because all it takes is you're one person. If you can talk to one other person who wants to take this seriously, then talk to that one person. All right. So like I said, I'm going to share back all these slides and make sure you have the opportunity to see what your colleagues are saying as well. One other question, should there be multiple crisis plans depending on the type of crisis? Yes, for sure. We want to make sure that there's somewhat tailored or baskets of types of crisis plans. Like you would have a very different kind of crisis plan for a cyber incident than you might be for something that happened to your physical office. There might be a different type of crisis plan for a reputation crisis versus a financial crisis. So don't get so many that you do nothing, but I would just say maybe you start from the most likely scenarios like a cyber crisis and say, what's the game plan on that? I think a reputation crisis might be interesting as well, because we can start to see how social media, mainstream media, alternative media can take something and spin it very quickly. And I think that's a scenario where you can start to say, hey, what's the lived experience of other organizations and what can we learn from their experiences? Or can we actually put that scenario on as an example on a future agenda, whether that's a staff agenda or a board agenda, and say, what would we do here? So thank you for that question. All right. I know we're at the top of the hour or getting close there. So I'm curious to know what's a top insight or takeaway from this session? Because what matters most is that this session makes a difference in your world. I'm curious to know what that is for you. And that will give you one more minute to ask any more questions that you have. All right. When you're doing that, there's another question. What ethical dilemmas might governance professionals face in a crisis? That's great because I think that how do we know that this is an ethical dilemma that's against the values of the organization, or is this where I'm not comfortable as a governance professional? So there's like all kinds of range on that. So, for example, if I take it to the personal side, I might believe that the right way to treat people in this crisis is this. My organization or my board is making decisions of that. Well, that may be more of a personally, I wouldn't do it that way feeling, but there may be times where, you know what, they are actually off base. This is against who we are, our policies. This is really serious. And so, if that's the case, hopefully your organization might have like a whistleblower policy or some process or even an ethics officer where you could actually go safely and raise that and say, you know what, this seems so far off of what's acceptable here. I don't know what to do with it. So, I think that if you have that mechanism, that would be great. If you don't have that mechanism, I would encourage that to be part of your crisis plan because there are times, and we've seen that in the news as well, where it was the whistleblower that actually really saved the day. And it takes a huge amount of courage to do that. So that's kind of the big one. But I also think it's an elevation. So as a governance professional, where is your concern? Is it at the board? Can you talk to the CEO about it? If it's really getting around the CEO and that's where you think the problem is, it's not a first place I would go, but having that opportunity to have a confidential conversation with the chair, if you feel like there's no other place to go, do that thoughtfully, but please know it's out there. I know I've known board chairs who have had people come up in a crisis and say, actually, the CEO is doing this thing that I consider really off base. And that chair, to her credit, took it incredibly serious, and they figured out the CEO was actually a major part of the crisis, and they hadn't seen it. So it's that balance between courage and safety and doing the right things. All right, let me go back to the questions, and then we'll make sure that you are out of here on time. Anything else in the chat or the question? All right. Yes, the chief legal officer is also the corporate secretary. Yeah, that's a common dilemma because in a crisis, you might need to be the chief legal officer, um, more so because of the legal nature of it, and you may be stretched on your duties as the corporate secretary. So maybe one of the things to think about in a scenario planning for that dual role is if that crisis were to happen, is there somebody who could step in as the backup corporate secretary? And if not, then is there any external resources that we could bring in to support either on the legal side or on the corporate secretary side? Because I think that at some point, likelihood is that one of those roles is going to be so significant, or both those roles are going to be so significant, there's just not going to be enough hours in the day. All right. Well, let me go. I think one more slide. So thank you. Thank you for being here today. I love the engagement online. If there's anything I can ever do to support you, happy to always take a phone call, always willing to take an email. And for the fun of it, that's a QR code that will take you to my virtual self. And if you want to ask me confidentially anything there that my AI knows, it's all my own work, so you can ask it. And if you need the human, I'm always happy to be here. So on that note, let me stop sharing, and Victoria, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very interesting to me, at least. I'm sure to everybody else, considering the questions and everything. So, thank you for presenting, and thank you for everybody that attended today's CPD webinar. I do look forward to seeing everyone at our next CPD webinar. It's on April 16th, so just 2 weeks away at 1 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be looking at the importance of a cyber resilience strategy with Hardeep Mehrotra. And you can find more information about that on our website. As you know from previous sessions, we do have a feedback survey at the end. We really appreciate if you just take a couple minutes to fill that out because we share it with our speakers as well as we take that to make our CPD sessions more relevant to our members later on. The recording of this session will be available on our YouTube channel within about a week. So look out for that and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Thank you, Victoria.